Hi and welcome to another episode of Research in Profile, brought to you by the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. My name is Seb Kaempf, and I'm joined here by Jolanda Jetten and Frank Moles, two colleagues here at UQ, who have come to us to speak about their new book. Before we get there, though, I quickly want to introduce both of them. Jolanda is a professor in social psychology at the School of Psychology here at UQ. Frank is a lecturer in public policy and governance at the School of Political Science and International Studies, also here at UQ. Guys, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, so we obviously invited you to come in because you've just published your brand new book, which is entitled The Wealth Paradox: Economic Prosperity and the Hardening of Attitudes, which was published with Cambridge University Press. Now, the first question I would like to ask you guys about the book is actually about the title. I find it really intriguing, The Wealth Paradox. I mean, what do you mean by the wealth paradox, and what is it more broadly that got you interested in this topic?
Well, as the title suggests, there was something that we discovered that was quite startling and surprising, and that was the normal link between prosperity, affluence, and attitudes. We have certain understandings about that. We tend to think that prosperity breeds milder attitudes. But when we started looking at it, quite the opposite turned out to be the case, where we found quite a lot of evidence of wealth and affluence being related, correlated, and with actually hardening of attitudes, which goes against the conventional wisdom view that as people have more wealth or more income, that they can afford to be more generous, that they don't have to feel as threatened by certain developments, say, for example, immigration. So what we found is actually an ironic or paradoxical trend that oftentimes when people have quite reasonable levels of income, that these kinds of anxieties can be more pronounced. So that to us was a really fascinating finding. Which led us to various observations, and the research, really coming back to your question about how did it all start, it came from some loose observations around things like populism. When do we see surges in populism? When do populist parties thrive and do well in the elections? Conventional wisdom would teach us, of course, that crises provide fertile soil for these kinds of parties to do well. But in fact, when we started looking at this more seriously as researchers, we found that no evidence whatsoever. If you look at 5 decades worth of populist voting and you set that off against certain things we typically use to look at crisis and economic performance, you see that the graph of things like per capita income, GDP, unemployment levels, and the times at which these parties do well does not really coincide. So that, for us, the wealth paradox was right there and then. Clearly, the assumption that crises provide fertile soil for populist movements was clearly something we didn't find.
Yeah, interesting. Jolanda, I would like to ask you to reflect a little bit about the main kind of puzzles, the theoretical conceptual issues that drive your book.
Okay, so one of the things that we realized when we actually started looking at how to explain that wealth is associated with these harsher attitudes is that we don't have a lot of theorizing in political sciences, but also in social psychology to explain these patterns. So the traditional view would be that maybe there's relative deprivation that leads people to lead them to actually endorse right-wing parties, say, right? So the feeling that maybe over time I don't have the resources, I don't get the income that I think I'm entitled to, that then is associated with disappointment, but also frustration that is taken out on minorities such as immigrants. Or you can also think about it through the lens of realistic conflict thinking, that if we have an economic recession, that there are fewer resources, there's greater competition over those resources, and then the first people that we certainly don't want to share with are immigrants, newcomers to countries, right? So we understand all of those dynamics, but what we actually noticed that at the other end of the spectrum, we don't really understand why people who are wealthy have a lot, right, have more than they need. Why is it that you actually also, for those who are wealthier in a society, why don't they want to share that? Why don't they want to open the borders and welcome refugees who flee their countries? So that was one of the paradoxes. How can we explain that? Or why is it in times of economic prosperity, when the economy is booming, why is it not that we sort of then also more likely to say, look, we got enough resources and there's enough to go around, and we can now afford to look after those who are more vulnerable in society. So that was the paradox that we struggled with, and we realized that in sociology, political sciences, also in psychology, there's a little bit of theorizing that helps us to explain this, but not a lot. So we really started from scratch, looking also at what have people written about this 100 years ago, and very interesting to actually engage in that process. And so the theorizing that we came up with is really this whole notion that if you're very wealthy, well, you have different concerns. You still have concerns. You might be very worried about losing your wealth, right? In particular with bubble economies, well, I have a lot right now, but maybe everything is gone tomorrow. Or maybe I'm no longer comparing myself to people at the bottom of the hierarchy, those who are unemployed or just don't have enough to get by. But if I'm quite wealthy, I compare myself to people even wealthier than I am, right? So the people who have 2 boats and I only have 1 boat. So it's almost what we found actually, that it's interesting that people start to get very obsessed with upward comparisons, and it becomes almost a bit like an addiction that they become very motivated to want to have more. And that also means then, well, I can't be generous, right? Because they're in this treadmill of wanting to go for more. Yeah?
I guess it doesn't happen all too often that we see a political scientist and a social psychologist or a psychologist write a book together. And you state at the very outset of the book already that it's a multidisciplinary approach. So I would like to hear a little bit more about what different assets each of you brought to this project and what bringing these different assets together allowed you to uncover that maybe either of the 2 disciplines would have missed otherwise.
Yeah, okay, great question.
Do you want to?
I'll start. I guess that basically, as political scientists, as social psychologists, we're interested in the same phenomena. Very often we are, at least, right? And here, in particular, if we talk about the rise of extreme right-wing parties in Western Europe, also in Australia, if we talk about all the issues that we really try to address in the wealth paradox, we're coming at it from different angles, but we're basically trying to solve the same puzzle. But of course, there's a difference in emphasis there, and I guess what Frank, as a political scientist, was focusing on is much more these macro developments, right? What happens at countries? What happens over time, historically speaking, right? If you look at a country like France, the rise of parties like Le Front National, well, how did that work? And when were they most popular? Was it in times of economic recessions or in times when it was going really well? So that was really an interesting analysis, and maybe you have to talk a bit about that, Frank. But I think what I added to it is maybe the more micro-analysis, looking at the psychology that is associated with feeling wealthy or feeling poor. And then also trying to look at the emotions that are associated with that. The whole idea that I feel threatened because I worry about losing my wealth tomorrow. Yeah. So, and then also trying to perhaps bring those issues in the lab, where in the lab I might make you feel wealthy, and then I really look at how you respond to particular types of threats. And what we found interesting is that analysis of really looking at countries, historical developments, these lab studies, surveys that we did, also some of the analysis you can do, say, on the world values surveys, that they all sort of point in the same direction, and that was pretty exciting for us. Anything you want to add to that? Or?
I think oftentimes when political scientists have something to say about attitudes, political attitudes, we get criticized for not having an account of micro foundations. That's oftentimes the problem. So we make these claims, we observe big patterns, we think we find something interesting, we think we have an explanation, but we can't make it stick quite at the level of the micro level foundations. So this is really, I think, the strength of the book, that we have the macro picture, but we also have the micro foundations through experimental work, where we see the various things coming up, in particular V-curve patterns, which Jolanda might want to talk a bit more about, which we witnessed both in the lab as well as in real-life situations. The Swiss referendum that was held a couple of years ago on EU immigration from EU countries was an interesting case study for us, where immediately when we knew this referendum was going to take place, that we said, well, according to our theorizing, we should be able to predict where the biggest resistance will be, in which cantons will be the biggest resistance. Will it be in the middle, or in the wealthy ones, or in the poor ones? And based on the V-curve theorizing, we could predict that it was in the deprived areas of Switzerland, in the very affluent parts of Switzerland, where we would find the most resistance against immigration, not in the middle. So it fitted perfectly. And these kinds of examples, this is just one of the things we could do because we had these two lenses, as it were. There is a third part to that story, which is, of course, leadership influence. Oftentimes, when economists look at these trends, they assume that these trends in and of themselves produce certain attitudes. But there's, of course, an intervening factors, and you could call these the meso-level factors. Leadership influence. Whether I worry about my poverty or about my wealth is not just a virtue of my wealth or my poverty, but it's what people tell me I ought to be worrying about. So if you have a populist leader who renders poverty salient, tells you you have not as much as you're entitled to, that's a good way of telling people of middle classes to say, well, you might be able to afford a luxury holiday, but you're still being exploited, you're still relatively deprived. So leaders are quite capable of turning objective gratification into perceived deprivation. And that's the middle level analysis that we also have in the book as last part of our book, where we see we can't forget that. It's not just about the objective economy and what that does to people, it's also how leaders and politics plays into it. Had we not written that chapter, it would actually not get the politics. That's I think, where the politics comes in.
I think that's a really good point to try to go to more of a zooming out phase, and I would like to ask you to reflect about the type of conceptual theoretical findings you've made in the research and that you present in the book.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the key findings of the book, as Jolanda already mentioned, is relative deprivation and relative gratification. These are the two key this is the key message in our book, that in order to understand the hardening of attitudes, including populist voting, for example, we need to understand both. So on the one hand, we've already produced quite a lot of evidence, I think, to say, well, the link between crisis and populist voting should not be taken for granted. That story is more complex. But we also have an account of who votes for populist party, because there's the when do populist parties do well. That we have actually revisited. We also revisited who actually is drawn to these populist parties. And that is the question where the relative deprivation and relative gratification comes to mind, where, as it were, you see two flows to these parties. It is indeed people who will feel objectively and relatively deprived. People who are doing it tough, so to speak, who might gravitate towards populist parties, but also, and the emphasis is very much on also people who are actually middle class, who are not per se doing it tough, and who might be earning more than average, who are equally drawn by these parties. So that, to us, is a real key finding, conceptually, the relative deprivation and relative gratification.
And a surprising one at that. Right? And
yes.
I know that you went quite in depth with various, as you called it earlier, the kind of micro focus that you have through various labs and experiments that you ran. And in fact, you ran through three particular themes or areas you focused on. From one dealing with the relationship between economic performance and attitudes towards immigration and minorities. Second one, the relationship between affluence and generosity. Yep. And then the third one, where you explored the psychological processes that were associated with relative deprivation and relative gratification. Jolanda, if you could take us in a sort of snapshot, Reader's Digest way through some of the things that you found doing these types of experiments.
Sure, I think what we actually start off in the book is looking much more at those macro levels. And I just want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's important. And one of the things that captured our attention was developments in the Netherlands around 2002, which is a time when in the Netherlands they had 5 years of booming economy, very low unemployment levels, but at the same time also within time of a year or so, a very sort of an extreme right-wing party or an anti-immigrant party that became very powerful, very popular, and that was the party by Pim Fortuyn. And it's very clear that if he hadn't been assassinated a few days before the election, that he was really contender for the prime ministership. So that was, it's almost, how can you reconcile that? So Frank was looking at that empirically, trying to get the timeline right there. But that was mostly sort of establishing the effect. But as you mentioned, we did also a lot of studies where we brought participants in the lab, and what we did is really, we wanted them to almost to study the psychology of wealth. It is, well, we make you wealthy. We make you, think at least for a little while that you're wealthy. Think of yourself playing Monopoly and you're winning, right? You know what kind of state you're in then, right? Compared to that to when you're losing and you're there and you just have to sit out the game. So this is associated with particular sort of emotions, but also frustrations. And that's what we tried to capture in a paradigm that we developed where we say to you, we say, Zeb, you're coming to hypothetical society. We called it Bimbola. We randomly allocate you to a wealthy or a poor group. And we actually, to make that a bit more meaningful, we say to you, Zeb, look, you're wealthy. Look, these are the houses you can choose from. You have to start your life here. So tell us, which house would you like to have? If you're very poor, well, we give you some very, poor houses, right? Not very attractive houses. But you also see what the rich people can choose from. So, and if you say, look, you say, but I really want to have that house, then this is all done on a computer. You actually get a message saying, look, sorry, Zeb, but you're poor. You have to stick with what you got. So, or we say to you, look, you can go on a holiday. If you're very poor, we say, sorry, but you don't have money to go on a holiday. If you're much wealthier, you have wonderful holidays. So everyone can see what the others can choose from, and it brings it to life a bit. And then we actually present them with, in this hypothetical society, there are new people coming to your society, and these people don't have anything. They need a bit of help to get their life started. Well, how much do you want to help them? Right? How much do you want to donate of your own wealth to give them a good start in life? And that's indeed what Frank was alluding to, where we find V-curve effects. So it is indeed, if I assign you to a very poor group, you will say, look, no, sorry, I can't miss any of my money, compared to people who are middle class, say. But the interesting thing for us was that if I make you feel relatively wealthy, say upper middle class, then you're also harsher towards those newcomers than if I make you actually feel that you're middle class. Yeah? So wealth is associated also with these harsher attitudes. And importantly, too, is that so we replicated that effect in lots of different studies, and this is also quite compatible with other research by people like Paul Piff and Keltner in the US and California, who also sort of do similar types of experiments, and they have good evidence that if I make you wealthier in the lab, then you're also more likely to lie, to cheat, to take money from others, compared to a condition where I actually make you feel less wealthy. So in combination, right, those sort of basic psychological processes that we studied there, sense of entitlement that we actually could observe when people feel wealthy. Well, I have a lot, right? I deserve to have this. No, I don't have to look after people who are worse off than me. That type of process that we could isolate there and find actually helps us to really explain those more macro level developments. So in a way, this is quite consistent with what sociologists would tell you. So for instance, in the Netherlands, there are quite a lot of books at the moment where they actually express concern about the hardening of society. Also in Australia, you have many newspaper articles, which is really sort of starting to say, well, you know, we Aussies, we're supposed to be this carefree, but actually, even though economically Australia has not been as badly affected by the global financial crisis as many of the Western European countries, still there's a sense of discontent. Where is this discontent coming from? So despite the relative wealth, there is discontent. So, and what I find interesting too, and this is one of the projects we're actually working on right now, is that we also look at what role does societal inequality play in that, and that we actually find that these processes and these concerns and the discontent is actually much more pronounced when that is also in the context of structural societal inequality. But just to get back to your question, because you asked about empirical findings about all three questions. So what Frank was talking about, we also have empirical evidence there, for instance, showing through the speeches that political leaders of right-wing parties do. So how can they actually make you believe that you're actually not as well off as you thought you are? You think that everyone tells you that we're actually in economically it's going well, but actually, you know, they convince you that you are actually relatively deprived. And the third theme in the book is indeed looking at charitable giving. And some of the data that Frank analyzed show really nicely, I think, that yes, of course, wealthier people give more than poorer people. But if you actually look at the percentage, then yes, you also have the extremely wealthy, like the Bill Gateses, who also donate a lot of their money. But actually, if you look at the middle or the upper middle class, then they actually, relatively speaking, donate less money to charity, good causes, than poorer people. So that's also there. We have some interesting data that we bring together in the book.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
I think that brings me to my last question. That is, what do the findings of your book ask us to do in terms of changing our thinking, the way in which we look at questions of politics, of wealth, and the hardening of attitudes, perhaps even the rise of what we currently see across the world, like right-wing extremist movements?
I think the one thing that the take-home message is, don't assume there to be a link between economic crisis and the hardening of attitudes. There is good evidence that populist parties thrive in terms of unprecedented prosperity. And I think that's a very powerful empirical message that we make in the book. The evidence, as it were, speaks for itself. The second question then is, who is it that is attracted to these parties? And that becomes a more complex puzzle, where relative deprivation, relative gratification are equally important. So these are the two key points. And it's interesting that we finished our work around a year and a half ago. The book was already submitted when, in 2016, of course, Brexit and Trump happened. And even though we don't speak about these phenomena in the book, because it was after that we finished our book, the findings now start to confirm exactly what we've been talking about. There's growing evidence now, both from the United Kingdom and the United States, that the people who carried the vote over the line for the populists, for Brexit, for the Leave campaign, and for Donald Trump were not the usual suspects. There's good evidence now that the Trump voter earns more than average, not less than average. There's good evidence now that in Britain it wasn't the working class per se who got the Leave campaign over the line. So when these things happen, it was almost fortuitous that our book had not really gone in print, because we could still make some minor changes, and we alluded to it in the introduction of the book. We had the chance to put a few footnotes and say, well, although we haven't studied Trump and Brexit, what we document in this book speaks very clearly to what we are witnessing now. And this is an unfolding story. And I think that our book we describe it not so much at the end as much as the beginning of a new research agenda, where we finally have to start taking seriously the link between prosperity and the hardening of attitudes. We present 7 hypotheses of why that might be. And I think there's plenty for people to engage with and to say, well, let's have a look at these hypotheses. And together we can probably build a research agenda that sheds light on these things. but also gets us away from standard narratives of the kind of cliches of the losers of globalization and Rust Belt states, which I think is a myth.
Yeah. Hence the paradox, or
Exactly.
rather the wealth paradox.
The wealth paradox.
Really fascinating and I think really important insights. So thank you so much for coming in. Thank you for tuning in. And if you, of course, are interested in finding out more about this fascinating research, you can find the link to Jolanda and Frank's book right underneath this video. And if you want to find out more about what we're doing at the School of Political Science and International Studies, you can equally find the web link under this video. Thank you very much for tuning in and see you next time.